Always the Shabbat before Purim is a special Shabbat. This year, we're reading Parashat Vayikra. Vayikra, the first word, appears in the Torah scroll and also in your Chumashim in a bit of a strange way. The Aleph, at the end of the first word, Vayikra, is written in smaller font size than the rest of the word. The Baal HaTurim, a famous medieval rabbi, explains that this was actually done at Moses' insistence. Moses, when he was writing down the scroll, wrote that Aleph in a small size. Why? Because Moses, he imagines, was correcting a mistake that was made by the first human being. If you read the first book of Chronicles, and I don't even read the first book of Chronicles, but if you look at it, it's in the back of the Tanakh, Divrei Hayamim. The first word of the first book of Chronicles is the word Adam. And the word Adam is written with an Aleph that is bigger than the rest of the letters of the word. So the Baal HaTurim imagines Moses correcting a certain mistake. Here was Adam, the first human being, whose big Aleph caused him to sin. What is Aleph? Aleph is Anochi. It's the capital I, we would call it in English. It's your ego. Adam was overconfident and conceited and thought he knew better than God, and that's what caused Adam to sin. Moses doesn't want to make the same mistake. He writes his Aleph smaller, saying, I will learn from what Adam did wrong. I will be humble. So Moses knew two things. Number one, he knew that overconfidence and pride can be a person's downfall. And he also knew that he had an obligation to learn from history, to allow history's lessons to reverberate so that the same mistakes are not made in the future. In his case, the same mistakes by leaders. So I would submit that these are two lessons that are particularly relevant to us in 5784 as we consider the lessons of October the 7th and that catastrophe. That first lesson about overconfidence, because just like overconfidence can lead to the downfall of individuals, it can also lead to the downfall of nations, turning strong armies into weak armies. There's no question that this catastrophe occurred, at least in part, due to the sins of overconfidence. Multiple warnings were ignored. Evidence was dismissed. Israel's political and military leadership clung to a false assumption that the enemy simply would not attack. But it's that second lesson, the lesson of learning from history and making sure not to repeat the same mistakes as in the past. That's what I think we really have to think about on this Parashat Zakhor, this Shabbat Zakhor. The primary lesson of Shabbat Zakhor is that healing is only possible through repentance and remembrance. Confronting the evils of the past is the most powerful generator of moral cleansing and fundamental reconciliation that we have. When we study the past, when we look at past injustices, we are more likely to recognize them today and correct the conditions that led to them. As the late Emil Fackenheim wrote, Jews consider history as a form of revelation. The Holocaust, he argued, despite its horrors, carried the commanding voice of history. To Fackenheim, this voice declared, "Thou shalt not hand Hitler posthumous victories. Jews must remain Jews. They must remember the victims of the Shoah. They must not despair of man, and they must not despair of God." History, as a form of revelation, it also may be the key lesson of the Purim story. Megillat Esther, as most of you know, meticulously excludes mentioning God's name. Instead, it urges us to hear God between the lines of the story, through the commanding voice of history. In all of the lessons of Purim, that evil exists, that we have to celebrate salvation, that we have to celebrate with friends, and through the mitzvot of Purim, we're commanded to care for the vulnerable, to connect to our community, and to read these lessons aloud every year so that we don't forget them. Purim is revelation. It is a holiday of Sinai, just like Shavuot. And I would offer that on October the 7th, a commanding voice called out to us again. A commanding voice, a voice of revelation that asks us to see the world differently. Bret Stephens, in a brilliant column a couple of weeks ago, he writes this, quote, "There used to be a sign somewhere in the CIA's headquarters that read, 'Every day is September 12th. It was placed there to remind the agency's staffers that what they felt right after the attacks of September 11, 2001, the sense of outrage and purpose, of favoring initiative over caution, of taking nothing for granted, had to be the mindset with which they arrived to work every day." End quote. On September 11th, in the United States and in many Western democracies, we saw up close that evil was real, that it was out there, that radical jihad and Islamic terrorism were real threats to our values and to the stability of the world. On September the 12th, there was resolve to confront that threat. But Stephens remarks that over time, not only did the sign disappear, but also its implicit message. The counterterrorism personnel who were warning about radicalization on our campuses were not being listened to. The forensic accountants who had been warning about Qatari money flowing into American educational institutions were dismissed as alarmists. The moderate Muslims and the politicians who had been screaming at the top of their lungs about the threats of radical Islam within our own borders were marginalized as fear-mongers and extremists. It's interesting to note all of this talk about Hamas being listed as a terrorist organization by Canada. Do you know when that happened? Hamas was listed as a terrorist entity under the Canadian Criminal Code in November 2002, about a year after 9/11 happened, when its lessons were still reverberating. But here we are, 22 years later. October the 7th happened, and Hamas fighters aren't terrorists anymore. They are freedom fighters. Mass rape and the murder of women are justified as legitimate acts of resistance. Theologically motivated terrorism is redefined as righteous anger. And in the Canadian House of Commons, where props are forbidden, just this week, we see members of Parliament proudly and flagrantly wearing keffiyehs, symbols of violent resistance against Israel. What in the world happened between September 11th, 2001 and October the 7th, 2024? What accounts for this radical shift in the way society views Islamic terrorism and its victims? Obviously, some people would argue that there's a double standard against Israel, and that's true. But I would also like to point out the very relevant fact that after 9/11, there was a strategic and coordinated campaign to silence, intimidate, slander, and shame anyone who was brave enough to speak about the threat of Islamic terrorism. Especially in Canada, the Islamophobe Mania industry, as Brooke Goldstein calls it, set out to change the narrative. The Islamophobe Mania narrative is not about opposing discrimination against Muslims. If that's all it was, I wouldn't have a problem with it, and nobody else would. No person should be discriminated or against or prejudiced for their religious beliefs. Islamophobe Mania is something else. It's setting its sights, a narrative that sets its sights on muddling the facts, on confusing the public, redefining Muslims as a victimized group, and therefore absolving them of responsibility and accountability when they commit religiously motivated crimes. The narrative told us we should be ashamed for talking about real issues of national security. We were told that it's politically incorrect to be calling out the radicalization happening within our own borders, and that diversity is our strength. One of their biggest achievements has been the transformation of Canadian institutions of higher education. Literally hundreds of millions of dollars in donations and tuition flow into this country every year from Islamic countries who hate Canada, like Iran, like Saudi Arabia, like Qatar. In the United States, it's billions of dollars. The flow of money incentivizes preferential treatment of certain preferred identity groups through diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. It inflames the fires of anti-Semitism and anti-Western sentiment on our campuses. And today, Canadian universities are totally addicted to foreign money and are panicking now that the federal government has said that it's getting out of control and it's time to impose limits. Through political correctness, through our universities, and through reckless immigration policies by the federal government, we have sold the moral integrity of this country. That is what has happened from September 11, 2001 to October the 7th, 2024. It's not September the 12th in Canada anymore. Well, Bret Stephens says it, and I'm going to say it too. If we're going to learn from Moses, and we're going to learn from Shabbat Zakhor, and we're going to learn from Purim, we have to make sure that in Israel and in Canada, in the whole diaspora, in every Jewish organization, in every synagogue, in every day school, we have to make sure that every day is October the 8th. For our non-Jewish friends too, who recognize the evil of Islamic fascism and who care about the security and well-being of Canada, who care about its values and see the country straying from the right path, every day must be October the 8th. What does that mean? It means that we cannot be blind and naive to the current state of the world. We may wish that it was otherwise, but every fact out there says that we are living in a time where the world is an increasingly dangerous place, where forces of instability and chaos are gathering strength, where there is corruption and fanaticism led by corrupt leaders who are solely out to collect power for themselves, to subjugate others, and to disrupt the stability of a rules-based global order. You've got to realize Israel is on the front lines of that conflict. That is why we've been saying, if you don't stand with Israel today, it's not just that you're standing with Hamas. You are standing against a peaceful and prosperous future for the whole world. It also means that on October the 8th, the Jewish community cannot accept here today, gone tomorrow friends, like some people in Ottawa who think they're our friends. Leaving Melanie Joly and Justin Trudeau aside, for a Jewish MP like Yara Sachs to have in the same week been photographed with a big smile on her face, shaking hands with Holocaust denier and terrorist supporter Mahmoud Abbas in Ramallah. And also to have voted in favor of an anti-Israel bill proposed by those NDP keffiyeh-wearing members in the House of Commons. It's not just tone deaf, it's reckless and severe moral misjudgment. She needs to be completely ashamed of herself. What happened this week in the Canadian House of Commons with the passage of that terrible NDP motion, I suggest, is not only a low point in Canadian Jewish history, but in the history of this country. There is no doubt in my mind that in years to come, Canadians will look back and they're going to ask, on October the 7th, when those terrorists crossed into Israel and they beheaded people and they raped people and they burned people alive and killed children in front of their parents and parents in front of their children, where was Canada? Where was Canada? When Trudeau said from this very pulpit that he'll always have Israel's back. Where was Canada? And we're going to have to answer that in March 2024, while Israel was in the midst of fighting against this sheer evil, Canada voted to deny Israel weapons and passed a motion in Parliament that effectively rewarded Hamas for their terror. This will be a badge of shame worn on the fabric of this country for generations to come, and a particular disgrace for Yara Sachs. And I want you all to know that our own MP in Willowdale, a Liberal, Ali Assassi, requested a meeting with me this week, and I absolutely refused, reminding him that in the elections of 2025, the Jewish community will remember its friends and will even more so remember the people who abandoned us. Let that sink in on Shabbat Zakhor. Our friends include Conservative MP Melissa Landsman and Liberal MP Anthony Housefather, who both spoke spoke passionately against the motion in the House of Commons. And they include the leader of the opposition, Pierre Poilievre, whose party unanimously voted against the motion. And I am so looking forward to welcoming him here to Beth Tikvah on the morning of October 7th, and I hope many of you, April the 7th. On the morning of April the 7th, and I hope many of you will register and will attend. This is October the 8th, friends. In an increasingly dangerous world, we need friends who will determine the direction of this country. Not here today, gone tomorrow, friends. Real friends. And it also must be said that what is true for Canada must be true for Israel. Israel's national security on October the 8th, we've learned, has to depend on something more than a high-tech fence. Throughout this war, something incredible has been happening in Israel. Stubborn Israelis have had the confidence to revisit practically every aspect, every tenet of the country's traditional security outlook. That progress is very healthy. Don't listen for a moment to the naysayers and the doomsayers. I am confident that sometime in the future, we will have in Israel a new leadership ready to face all of the security challenges currently plaguing the country and to work towards that peaceful and prosperous future that Israelis and Palestinians all pray and hope for. One day, there will be a Megillah written, the Megillah of October the 7th. It will be filled with stories of tragedy and violence and despair, of friends and allies, of enemies and foes. But it will also be filled with stories of unity, heroism, and optimism. It will carry forward the message of Zakhor, to never forget what happened on that day, the lives we lost, and the sacrifices we made on that day and in the months following. And if we are wise, this Megillah will also celebrate a new era that was ushered in on October the 8th. The lessons we learned about alepphs that were too big and alepphs that were too small. The repentance we had to pursue and the friendships that sustained us. And through all these stories, we will still hear God's commanding voice, history speaking to us as revelation. And we will affirm, La Yehudim haita ora v'simcha, v'sason vikar, kein tiyeh lanu. As our ancestors had light and gladness, joy and honor, so it will be for us too. Shabbat Shalom and Chag Purim Sameach.